I find movie remakes mostly tiresome, but there are a few gems here and there, and I find the movie Maniac being one of them. The original movie came out in 1980. Since the film was not submitted to the MPAA, the film was released unrated with a designation for adults only. I first saw it in the 80s on a VHS. The director, William Lustig, who previously directed pornographic films, used profits from his 1977 film Hot Honey to make Maniac. I haven't seen the movie Hot Honey, but a lot of the scenes in Maniac had to be filmed guerrilla style because they didn't have enough money for permits. So I'm guessing Hot Honey wasn't a huge hit. Joe Spinell starred in this. He played character roles in some pretty big movies like Rocky, The Godfather, Taxi Driver, and Cruising. When this movie came out, it sparked some outrage. I know nowadays everything sparks some outrage, but in the 80s there was no internet. So there were less things that people could find to piss themselves off about. The current movie rating system emerged in 1968 when the MPAA chairman Jack Valenti replaced an earlier moral censorship guideline known as the Hays Code. And I bring this up because Maniac was one of the early films that got the censorship ball rolling that was embraced by both the political left and right. And why even remake this movie? Most remakes are trying to cash in on movies people like or are familiar with. Maniac is not that kind of movie. The original movie was nasty and violent, and I really liked it, but not many people watched it, and nobody's really clamoring for a remake of it. This is the basic plot. Frank, a landlord, was abused as a child by his prostitute mother, and as a result becomes a serial killer who murders women, scalps them, and attaches their hair to mannequins. After he awakens from a nightmare about killing a couple on a beach, he dresses himself and has scars all over his body. He leaves his apartment and is invited inside a hotel by a prostitute. She kisses him and he strangles and scalps her. He returns home, dresses the mannequin with the undead woman's clothing, and nails her scalp to its head. Frank tells himself that beauty is a crime punishable by death. Later he leaves, taking a collection of weapons with him, including a shotgun. He drives around and finds a couple leaving a local disco. When the guy starts up the vehicle after his date sees Frank spying on them, Frank kills the couple with his shotgun and then adds the woman's scalp to his mannequin collection. After seeing his recent crime on television, he talks to the mannequins and sobs himself to sleep. The next day, Frank follows a photographer named Anna after she takes a photo of him and a little girl riding a bicycle. At night, Frank sees a nurse leaving a hospital. He stalks then murders her with a bayonet and takes her scalp. Later, Frank heads to Anna's apartment and she recognizes him from the photo, so she invites him in. He asks her out to dinner and shows her a picture of his mother who died in a car crash a few years ago. A couple of days later, Frank is invited by Anna to a studio during a photo session. She introduces one of her models, Rita, to him. After seeing the two talking and holding hands, he steals Rita's necklace and leaves. Later that same night, he arrives at Rita's apartment to give her the necklace, then attacks her and ties her to the bed. Frank talks to her, calling her his mother, then stabs her with a switchblade and scalps her. One night, Frank takes Anna on a date and they stop by a cemetery to visit Frank's mother's grave. While laying some flowers beside the headstone, Frank begins to mourn over his earlier victims and attacks Anna. He chases her around the cemetery, but she gets away. He imagined his decomposing mother attacking him from the grave. He runs back to his apartment where he sees his mannequins coming alive. They mutilate Frank with his weapons and pull his head off. The next morning, two officers break into Frank's apartment, finding him lying dead on the bed, having committed suicide by stabbing himself. After the officers leave, Frank's eyes suddenly open. Only small changes are made in the remake. Most of it's shot from the murderer's point of view, and some of it's shot from other people's point of view. This time, Frank is a schizophrenic young man who has taken over his family's mannequin restoration business after the recent death of his mother. Frank was traumatized as a child by his mother, a prostitute who made him watch her have sex with her johns. Frank still kills women and scalps them in this remake. In one instance, Frank joins a dating site where he gets a date with a woman named Lucy. The two go out to dinner, return to Lucy's apartment. Frank strangles Lucy, scalps her, and takes her hair back to his apartment where he attaches it to a mannequin. It's surprising they kept the woman being scalped in the remake. I would have expected them to tone that down a little, but they didn't, and I'm glad they didn't. One morning, Frank awakens to find a photographer named Anna taking photos of the mannequins in his storefront. He invites her in and she admires his work restoring antique department store mannequins. They develop a friendship, with Frank agreeing to help Anna put together an art exhibit using mannequins. He falls in love with her and starts taking medication to control his violent urges. Which doesn't stop his killing. If it did, we wouldn't have much of a movie. At the exhibit, Frank meets Anna's boyfriend Jason, as well as art director and Anna's mentor, Rita. Both mock him for his interest in mannequins, questioning his sexual orientation. Frank later follows Rita home and ties her up. Identifying Rita with his mother, he scalps Rita while she's still alive in a fit of rage. The next day, Anna tells Frank of Rita's death and her breakup with her boyfriend Jason. Frank comes to Anna's apartment to comfort her, but reveals his guilt by mentioning things that only the killer would know. Realizing that Frank is the killer, Anna stabs him through the hand before locking herself in the bedroom. Anna's neighbor breaks into the apartment to save her, only for Frank to kill him with a meat cleaver. Breaking down Anna's door, Frank knocks her unconscious. He puts her into his van and drives home. As he opens the door, she regains consciousness and stabs him in the stomach with a piece of rebar attached to the mannequin hand. She flees as picked up by a passing car, whose driver panics at the sight of blood-covered Frank and runs him down. Crashing and flinging Anna through the windshield, Frank goes to the injured Anna and scalps her as she dies. He returns to his apartment, attaching Anna's hair to a mannequin dressed in a bridal gown. As he succumbs to his injuries, he suffers hallucinations of the mannequins transforming into his victims. They begin to tear his body apart, finally ripping off his face to reveal a mannequin head. Before he dies, Frank sees Anna, who's wearing a wedding dress, lower her veil and turn her back on him. A SWAT team breaks into Frank's apartment, only to find his corpse in his closet along with his collection of scalps. I thought both movie endings were absolutely horrific, and I loved them both. Did you know that in 1989, Joe Spinell died at the age of 52? He cut himself in his glass shower door after slipping in the bathtub, and he bled to death. According to the people who wrote the song Maniac for the movie Flashdance, that song was inspired by the movie Maniac. One of the songwriters said that an early line for this song was, "He's a maniac, maniac, that's for sure. He will kill your cat and nail him to the door." But those lyrics were changed to, "She's a maniac, maniac on the floor, and she's dancing like she's never danced before." Which probably makes more sense in a movie about dancing. In the original Maniac, the abused child turning into a serial killer wasn't an overused trope. The violence, nudity, and the grunginess of the movie left a heck of an impression on the viewer, both good and bad. And I think the remake did a great job of capturing all of that. If anyone sat through this, thanks for sticking it out. I know I talked quite a bit about scalping. I'm going to be starting a garden tour for the Halloween season. It will be in a few parts, and I'll be covering the horror genre, fruit trees, flowers, occultism, and all of that. Good night. Boo.